hyper additional to the good and bad communications and non-communications. Another way, on top of that, will change it instantly. We can get to if we can get threshold nations with nuclear and the whole species body to understand how peaceful nuclear generation is forced relied upon it by people with on a mass scale from tactically denatured before our feet everywhere all the landscape theater a whole bunch of ways as America's founders communicated to us. They had declassified for us how the suburbs were designed before America's founders were born for a torture, extortion, back nature, slavery method, northern colonies and southern colonies. And they had to leave it northern states, southern states, and they couldn't go into their they couldn't go into how they were against it. But everyone was forced, checked, hurt, and persuaded. They counter-extorted with James Madison's plan, who didn't even once he was a president, he still didn't have free speech. You know, he had the leverage of Native Americans and of colonists together, who could only to an extent counter-extort the other presidents, beginning with George Washington. You guys don't even allow people to be honest about the extortion of George Washington. But simultaneously, you have delusions that are relative. This is why and how we need experts on such. But there are all kinds of organized crimes rules and wire and methods, whole predicate acts methods. Dominion voting, for example. Please, Dominion voting. There are people involved with FBI Director Robert Luskin, former standing chairperson on the Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, involved with a whole bunch of different countries. A whole bunch of people tied to the name Scalora have been they're faking ties to me since I was a kid, with the same house/s. Further involved with child abusers, leaders of kids, years apart, first forest, and rolls with that further with sexual and medical offenders of kids. A whole bunch of people tied to it. And Wethersfield Police forging and switching names, refusing to get on paper. They faked conversations of me and me being at the Wethersfield Police Station as a kid, and now as an adult too. These are also ones with their cultures and other people's cultures and differences, their sexual groups, their differences used for and their religious spots and names next to them, used by a breaching method that uses already recorded themselves with all sides of criminal and civil cases, their lawyers, their family members, their sources, the news, the same thing, the same way. And the names of the interbranch. The difference of the guilt is always different, but it's other ways it's only increasingly equally valued. Like relative to where and to how you all have collusion/s. If anyone tries to use the hyper evidential, we don't even need it written in a book. We have black people's rights of eyes. We have means to discern the experts being and haven't been used as collusions. The difference of their guilt or the overt criminal enterprises, the private ones that were forced on our founders too. In other words, and terrorists. When did that stop being the difference of that guilt or the other countries all forced to be carried? We're forced to be unity and independence by nature, but we're ignoring that system. But it's exploited by a breaching method, and nature is demonstrating that too. But the breaching method shows all the identities, suits, ties, counters, exceptions. They have to keep those demonstrations blamed on other things other than themselves for their own hyper additional motivations, natures, needs, interests that no one wanted, but that's forced out location/s everywhere the human species body has a body. And anybody that tries to counter it, they are sensed right through our own. That's why we have to pay attention to what I caught them doing with reason at each age. I'm not even a doctor. You know, they've been criminal. They recorded themselves right through world wars with people from our country. They're right there recorded using their differences, their passions and emotions, like Hitler's name. No one paid attention to how they had roles here and there with the same things and with criminally foreign influence databases and torture, extortion, fact, nature, slavery, therefore physical. In other words, although that's your opinion, we think this about the jobs. Look at New York City, those people packed in the buildings. So across the country, suburban/urban, suburban, designed before America's founders were born. They wanted to build better and safer then. They didn't even have free speech. In other words, you guys think we have it now. They were tortured, extorted, with internationally monitored conversations. And it was against the law. I learned that in notes at Central Connecticut State University. It was against the law for anyone to even be heard speaking about having heard, not telling on someone they heard speaking about building infrastructure outside of internationally monitored conversation. I said, in other words, that was before cars were even built, before our founders were even born. And those homes are still standing. Now we have means to traverse the ocean and the sky. And we have the suburbs, the suburban/urban that unfolded the way they set it up, while they still had slavery sickly distinctly, northern colonies and southern colonies entrenched, and northern states before America's founders were born, and they forced it and them not to be able to speak about it. All I could do was tell us to get the Constitution unabridged. Why and how we have rights are too numerous to have to list them, let alone them blow the questions of witch trials, courts, and the difference of them, their guilt, the other countries, the groupings of them, or the complete, in other words, the work criminal enterprises, the private ones, all that is in a list. Collusion/S with the location/S that no one wanted. But now when everyone wants to use fact treatments the way they only allow, appreciate it, and in response to it, on a mass scale, they are faking and changing what we are saying. How they're getting away with it is by putting predicate acts with facts against everyone in databases relative to their rules sensing. Like, for example, American history, what witch trials about, even if they're completely made up. What slavery was about was collusions with a human fact tripping nature breaching method that no one wanted collusions with. No one wanted roles with it. But that was only allowed. In other words, otherwise that body would be sentenced. And they would make sure that everyone had roles hurting each other and themselves to an extent with their subject treatments, their fact treatment, nature, quality aspects, and nature itself. Otherwise, that body would be sentenced, including if that body was a majority of people, including if it was everybody. All we have, in other words, you don't see this preaching method made them, delusions wrought too, but also criminally foreign influence. Persuaded to make subject treatments of, okay, let's make a subject treatment of what about which trials are about, and then have that separate. It's not real science, but then they want that defended and pretend it's debatable. It forces self-value more and more. What can't be defended? What did you read? James Madison, he had declassified for himself, for us, things about why and how they did not have free speech, about why and how George Washington agreed to help them and to extort the rest of the colonists and the rest of the Native Americans. And I say the rest of them because nature itself is showing us that Native Americans, but not just because nature, not just because President/Chief shows us this too. They were a part with that unity that was capable of countering, of getting George Washington means to counter at key locations inside of more than 13 states to make people break the syntactical laws that even the overt criminal enterprises and the private ones were relying upon. Per fear that was righteous, but not by nature, only by nature as criminal insidiousness, as rules with a human fact cheaping nature breaching method, a predicate acts with facts delivery system method, and or the difference of it as that or as a criminal insidiousness nature delivery system method. In other words, and we can make a hyper peace method. So we could get, in my words, they're speaking about how they have to look for if there's exhaust come out, where they're doing to enrich things, because they don't know how to speak. They know, okay, we have, they make the subjects apart. They put the threats of nuclear weapons or and they separate it from the peaceful nuclear generation threats. And they separate that from wars when people are just with guns. While we're still on the suburbs that were designed before America's founders were even born. The exceptions of wealth and city. The breaching method only allows that to be. The breaching method has countries A through Z, only operable through locations, areas, and states' names. Only allowed to leave the breaching method's roles with A through Z out, even though we can discern. It's one of the things that modern religious messengers are about. Already, they come with demonstrations of already the campuses have become criminally foreign influence, tactical illusions raw. There are proofs from off them. And then hyper additionally, because that's how it is now too. And in layers of apparent and even the real motivations propagated by the breaching method self-cultivated. In other words, the hyper additionally repropagated. So all these people need to hunger and thirst through our systems, jobs, that system's tactical terror than the one that has difference with our short words and long words, no, too. With the human species body of individual bodies. With all group differences generated by that which is showing us it has other species bodies of individual bodies with all group differences as with that which is not us, is not them, but is all things anyway. And to an extent right there, it is discernible in other ways. It is the body that binds those three parts of time. Like how the future is hyper invisible, but still discernible. Even if they never get here. As the future as it is simultaneously the body of the season. The seasons, even if they never get here again, we can discern its body to an extent. They're complete their body already. Because we have been shown this. Because it is manifest. It is an identity of volume that is making more of its identity of forever nature through temporary / lasting space nature. In other words, I forgot what I entitled this video. See my shadowboxing playlist, people. Shadowbox the whole species body launch. In other words. So, like, with Russia and Ukraine and America, like how our countries are forced to be by nature unity, and by nature not as criminal insidious nature, but it will make that too needing to be forced this way. That's why we have to pay attention. We are a system tactical terror from the hypernative one, and we get the whole species on the page with the crazy threats because of how like even a Fukushima had a wave from the ocean attack their break their power plant and almost made it a huge disaster, even worse than that huge disaster it made. Just a single wave. They have technology where it has to keep for them, like CNN when they report on this, they have to keep cooling it. They have to keep it cooling it with fresh water. And then too, in other words, nature wants us to communicate from river to sea. And see, but they have this small spot there. I must have that with it. Why everyone's keeps them out. How could they have all these problems? And that's what Netanyahu's trying to counter. It's people speaking about the river to the sea. She's just trying to infuriate people at countries A through Z. And the reason why is because it's inter and intra-cultural. Not one country had possession of their identity. And they value things like wars to pretend other. They value things like service to pretend other. When the interbranch, they were raised criminally foreign influence, tactical illusions raw, black pupils. They have whole careers kept criminally foreign influence, tactical illusions raw. They'll ask for forgiveness, and that, we understand a breaching method kept that. But they don't want to understand when, in other words, when they're framing people, and when even killer, there's a serial killer, a reported serial killer. There are a whole bunch of ways and means and needs that the people of his jail have been torturing him and need to torture him. People with the state corrections offices and judicial branch offices to hide what they have collusions with the names next to his place. And they themselves don't even know the extent of it. The extent /s. See, everyone's the plural parts of the breaching method that knew that the proverbial devil, no, the proverbial shaitan. Stay tuned. He's speaking. The beginning of the Quran and the beginning of the Old Testament. The beginning of the Old Testament has a part that says, only defend right here, where the names of the people, the sciences will come together in the part that comes before it. How come I've never heard that said by anyone? It's very short. And the beginning of the Quran has a part that says, all that matters is if one's going to be honest, if one's going to be honest about their use of the name, for the scientific value of the name of all spaceless existence, as Allah or not. And it says love too the people who don't, as long as they're honest. It does say kill whoever's not honest about it. But the reason it says that, it doesn't say all that matters is if you don't eat pork, or all that matters if you wear some kind of dress. Maybe in the other part of the Quran it says that. I don't even know. I only read to the part where it says all that matters. All that matters, and it qualifies it. It said don't pray in a mosque for the slightest reason. You guys aren't given the individual voice, independence, and unity of the might of the species body, of individual bodies. Not just unity, but unity its way. That one is the way of that which has the other species bodies, that birds, fish, individual distinct species bodies of individual bodies. We are shown the difference, not just of numbers. We're shown what is simultaneously greater than and more finite than infinity, while not as infinity, but as anyway. In many pray, because it's an identity of forever nature that is being shown to us. Again, this way. Traditional Navajo teachings, they refer to us as the five-fingered being. Someone was just saying another YouTuber, Judge Napolitano's live stream. And no, Dominion voting, please. It's not just you guys personally, but you guys are such passionate attack President Trump. I understand why people attack individuals' names of leaders because of the campuses roles. They're forcing it. They have to be put, in other words, the whole species will get behind you. You guys, in other words. But we have to pay attention to how consciously we can observe hyperarchaeologically. The suburbs were designed to cause negative value nature progressions, acts, and natures while being a landscape theater. Valuing more and more, while simultaneously not valuing it. See, everyone's forced to roles with this breaching method. Valuing more and more the only means to cause positive value, nature, progressions, acts, and natures is if the self-value roles not just with criminal insidiousness natures of means to cause positive value, nature, progressions, acts, and natures, but ones as time collusion / S with the breaching method's needs. For syntactical appreciation of positive and negatives like truth, facts, crimes. So we have the words, the people speaking about crimes, like with the witch trials or with the slavery. They were rules with predicate acts with facts method / S, but they were the / S part. They are rules with a different racketeering method, worse than war crimes. See, we are different than the other species bodies. And we have different color eyes at the same time. Except there are exceptions. Some people apparently have black pupils, and the exceptions part is black too. So we pure straight up have the same color eyes, black. In other words, and we know. So in other words, we still have had this left out from subject of slavery. Additionally from this, we have the breaching method's roles with that left out. Additionally with this, the breaching method measures and maintains uses of the everyone blaming other things, others, or ourselves in self-valued roles, justifying their logic, their arguments, and their nature with that by self-valuing of these books, the research. Our founders declassified for us to explain such and why and how they had to leave slavery entrenched. Our founders wanted nothing to do with it. Our schools have been state collusions. We know as victim predators / hyper victim, hyper predators. In other words, well, we could observe that. And what that means, I'm referring to it that way, for example, too, because there is that distinct identity of simultaneous nature. So I refer to it as a hyper simultaneous nature. That which is not our species body is not the other species body, but we are distinct from them, but we are non-distinct from them, and we are simultaneous with them. But again, per that further hyper simultaneous, further greater than ourselves together and apart, and simultaneously more finite than ourselves. While together, even together and apart. I mean, obviously. So in other words, boxing just things we do. In other words, but we instead of making peace, we make countries and play like a game. Well, it's not fair because it was never fair because how the breaching method is rolls with all negotiation, all syntax. It plays that. It's not anything it does through ourselves. In other words, imagine. In other words, not opinions. People would say, it's against the Constitution's abridged if we're voting on slavery, and then people would pretend that's opinion. One of the reasons they would get away with it is because of where and how people, the members of self, black or white, in other words, where we have to use it as a subject. You guys are predators, A through Z. Otherwise, you are censoring anybody, including when they're a majority of people, including when they're a whole country trying to adapt to this together. And it's adapted to. Right through our schools in America, they're criminally foreign influence / hyper criminally foreign influence. To blame other countries, we're going to mess it up. It's not right. There are roles with it, but that's because our own people believe it. You guys have, in other words, there's a hyper foreign involved here, maintaining that the outcome. Maintaining nature's demonstrations of this human fact, human nature breaching method that countries A through Z blame the other things, others themselves, including the roles with it. And the breaching method knew that's where it could lock them. Blaming roles on other things, others until things were true, and then still using that truth. The breaching method measures and maintains the voices of the names of the experts on each country's history, like America and Russia. I don't know about Russian history. I know there's a Catherine the Great. In other words, but I know this too better than their experts. The suburbs from America to Russia to Ukraine, before America's founders were even born, our countries were shared here and there, but now shared here and there, grouped tacticalitarian from what could speak about group differences or appreciate group differences. And we can't do that and afford to have appreciated more and more how nature communicates. And as nature is generating group differences, but when nature is not criminal insidiousness nature, more and more the names of the people of the sciences cannot afford to have discerned phrases like criminal insidiousness by people of all ages, especially differentially. And like, for example, especially with the kids. American history cannot be understood properly without understanding the phrases like criminal insidiousness and criminal foreign influences / hyper criminally foreign influences. And we could discern this where and how the breaching method had those crazy laws and even slavery, northern colonies and southern colonies sickly distinctly, and there were more than 13. So in other words, and people will start. Well, it's not that they'll change their mind. They'll have faith because they'll have a means to and a nature of industry / S, and a nature of relief / S from industry / industries to never stop having roles with the differences between overt criminal enterprises, private ones, terrorists. The other countries, our own members in branch of government intelligence, the state judicial branch offices of Connecticut, the corrections offices, the location / S never stop being used criminally foreign influence / hypercriminally foreign influence. Forgiveness is also important because we have to pay attention to guilt where everyone can be caught simultaneously guilty and or simultaneously sentencing for the breaching method. Like with black pupils, white survivors, one of the many things we're going to observe simultaneously. We're not going to appreciate things like witch trials separated from the breaching method against Native Americans against Native Americans. The breaching method has simultaneously used the difference of that to hide between two by helping them in ways too, with collusions, criminal and ceaseless natures of positive treatments, of positive appreciations, and of negative appreciations. Also to increasingly screen in the future too. The breaching method that's increasingly being demonstrated to of humanity, having been demonstrated to it. But again, those demonstrations came with demonstrations of negative value nature, progressions, acts, and natures also already having been employed effectively to roles with it, with the breaching method, blaming other things, others, ourselves on those things. Those are types of people and things that are types of victim predators they need to value. Entertaining and only allowing people to have things like subject treatments like witch trials, separated from the slavery law, separated from the breaching method, the difference to racketeering method / S. There was a singular method there. Northern colonies and southern colonies. Crossed from America to Russia to Ukraine. Even though we have cars and we have all this technology means. See, but the technology is still in the hands of criminal and seditious natures of debate that contain criminally foreign influence, faction, nature, quality aspects in nature, and roles with the exploitation / S, aware and of how and of why. Not just America's founders, but other countries' founders also did not have free speech, and they had to pretend other to an extent or to be sensed, just as every single individual does. Any grouping of nations to try to counter what this does, while entertained logic and nature of the locations, areas, and states, as is. In other words, for the country, they can't do anything but add that, make it harder to discern the breaching method and the identity of all space / existence itself. There's a difference between death and lease of hadiths lease of Hadith, defined by me as force, space, nature transfer. But I'm reading this off nature itself. We could discern. Earth's a special difference is forced from here. Because we are systems no longer, that are criminally foreign influenced. The only reason there are self-bodied roles with it is because the country's eighth vizier that are used remotely, never stop being by another name evolved. And it has nothing to do with that which is on paper. All exception nature come with demonstration, /s of the same thing, /s. But in other words, there are predicate acts with facts methods and readings of statutes and precedents like they already recorded themselves. Sequence shifting and pretending not to hear things and thinking that and typing fake things, pretending passions, emotions online at places as the lawyers of the FBI and of the Wethersfield Police, for example. Where they have readings of statutes that give them the benefit of the doubt at the last second. And where and how they know also they can rely upon how, even though they know that is at least plausible, that on a mass scale they're putting faked and changed evidences into databases. They hold fake transcripts and ties it to people as collusion /s also with the crime scenes, with only natures of locations and names allowed to counter such properly, legally. Where and how there are exceptions too. They're incapable of treating those properly either. Forgiveness is because where we're going to discern the breaching method is where we're going to pay attention to the collusions here. They have never gone away. Why many pray, but here we have. In other words, so humanity, we have to understand every country was and is sickly, distinctly a victim of a fact treatment nature method. And this method knows that they need to use phrases like criminal foreign influences because they won't be able to discern the hyper-criminal foreign influence method that has the differences of their roles as suits and ties, counters, exceptions at the same time with overt criminal enterprise, private ones. Not the ways that they even know, that we don't even know about. Like where they have acting professors and people that, in other words, get down. I'll gather around. I'll show you what's causing the problem. And we don't leave out the black people's whites of eyes from any subject, black people. I'll see the whites of eyes. And we'll